Welcome. You're watching CNBC Africa's special Road to Davos broadcast as we build up to the World Economic Forum's 2019 annual meetings in Davos. Welcome. I'm Esther, Awoniyi. Thanks for joining us. At the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos next year will focus on shaping a new architecture for the next wave of globalization. Well, joining me to share some perspective on this and the outlook for Africa next year, I have in the studio with me Andela, Osakwe, CEO of Agrolay Ventures. She's also a World Economic Forum global leader. Also joining me today is Iyinoluwa Aboyeji, co-founder of Andela. He's also a World Economic Forum young global leader. He's also, So those are our guests for today. Thank you so much for taking the time out to join us today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Esther.
Thank you very much.
Interesting theme for Davos for next year. Globalization 4.0, shaping a global architecture in the age of the fourth industrial revolution. Now, that is something that we've talked about a lot in the course of the year, the fourth industrial revolution. Yeah. How that is playing out in Africa, I mean, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence. We've seen a bit of that driving innovation on the continent, but I wanted to start from globalization first, then work our way down there. Globalization, there have been arguments this year for and against. We've seen that pushback, and by that I mean the wave of protectionism that we've seen. There have been arguments for and against. And many top economists, incidentally, have actually said that those who have benefited from globalization are actually fewer than those who haven't benefited from globalization. But they say that that's still not to say that we shouldn't forge ahead with globalization, because obviously there are benefits. I'd like you to share your perspective. When you hear those arguments, what do you say to yourself? Okay, what do we begin to do to ensure that we have more people in that bracket benefiting?
Honestly, the globalization debate has been an age-long one. I think about nearly 2 decades ago when I was reading Joseph Stiglitz's book, talking about globalization and its discontents. You have economists who have predicted and talked about the inequalities that this drives and the issues that come about with that. But what have we done in the last 20 years? They were more or less focusing, how do we fix it and how do we get ready for that? But instead, we're now 2 decades later. In 2016, you have the rise of Brexit. The same time, you have the rise of Donald Trump and issues around protectionism and sovereignty. And you have to ask yourself that, they are increasingly pushing for a situation where globalization is a zero-sum game. And that's really that. If someone's better off, I'm obviously worse off. But it doesn't have to be the case. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. We can all win. And that's my view on globalization. Let's understand the challenges and address them in a collaborative way. Let's cooperate as business leaders, as governments, as civil society, and think about how we can address this issue so that we can have a more equal world. And that really is what Davos is about in 2019. It's about how do we collaborate, how do we cooperate, and work towards constructive dialogue to bring about a new type of globalization in the age of the fourth industrial revolution.
Iyinoluwa, what is your perspective?
I share similar sentiments, but I really think that at the heart of some of the failure, quote unquote, of globalization we're seeing today is a sense of dilemma, really, about when you think about commercial interests and what they represent, and when you think about the public interest and what it represents, and the lack of one of the major stakeholders in the WEF ecosystem, Professor Schwab, describes as a shared stakeholder value approach to building society. What has failed with globalization is that you've had some nations make choices that put profits before people. And as a result, you've created an increasingly less equal world as a result, where not everybody has the opportunities, and those who do have the opportunities continue to double down on their opportunities, by moving capital, by moving resources, by taking other people's land. And that's really what's the core flaw with globalization. But if you think deeply about the countries that have benefited from globalization, it's because they've taken a human capital-centered approach to it. So you think about China, which has been, over the same last 20 years, been very focused on lifting people out of poverty. You take a look at India, which has been, over the last 20 years, been very focused on building human capacity in their country. And then you take a look at Africa, which is complaining about the effects of globalization, but quite frankly has a political class that hasn't prioritized its competitiveness in globalization. So they deserve to be victims. as a collective.
Yeah, that's an interesting point of view. Well, I mean, some of the solutions that have been put on the table, final point on globalization, have been put on the table are for government, especially a continent like Africa, for governments, and the agriculture space was taken, used as an example, incentivize farmers. Give them loans. If you're not a social program, you know, as in the sense of it, just to give them that support so that they can compete with big businesses, so that they don't feel left out, so that they have, for that farmer in his little corner in a village somewhere, so that he has access to market, he has access to good seeds. And you're a player in the agriculture space. So is that would you say that's a good place to start?
It is one of the places to start. We have so much to do. There's a plethora of things, but definitely we have to feed ourselves. We can't keep spending the amount of money we do importing food that we can actually grow locally. But what I try to push, and for us to have a mindset shift, is, you know, we always do this focus on the farmer, which is absolutely right. We have millions of them, over 10 million of them in Nigeria alone. In the continent alone, we have much more. They are the biggest population for us in that sense, and they feed us. But if you keep focusing on the seeds and ensuring that they increase their production without ensuring that that production is bought or that it's processed and the value chain is taken care of, it's useless. They keep being in a vicious cycle of poverty, right? Because no one's buying the goods. It gets, you know, prices fall because they have to sell it off, and you keep going round and round in circles. So you are promoting poverty as opposed to trying to build wealth. For me, we need to focus on transforming our food systems. It's the entire food system. We have to start thinking through, the entire world is thinking about using technology, finding new ways to use land more productively, finding new ways to stop using pesticides or fertilizers, and ensuring that it's not just about food, it's about good food, about nutrition, about thinking that we're living better, healthier lives. And for me, it's about the entire transformation of the food system. So that way you're not only thinking about the farmers, but ensuring that they have the processing facilities to buy from them, you have the retailers who are putting those products, and that we're tapping into the $3 trillion food market that Nigeria today you're not seeing. So for me, it is a good focus, but it needs to be a broader vision to be relevant in the world today.
Okay. Now, Iyinoluwa, obviously, another big theme and the buzzwords we're going to be hearing at WEF next year is the fourth industrial revolution.
Absolutely.
And there's been a lot of, there have been so many conversations around how Africa perhaps can leapfrog in that respect, and if we are already beginning to effectively deploy them, of course, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence. And for AI, when I look at what some of our financial institutions are doing at the banks, especially in the payment system, for customers who want to use their internet banking, we now have this AI, we have this artificial intelligence who can communicate with real time with customers without them having to go to the brick and mortar, the banking halls. So in your perspective, how are we on the continent, or perhaps even in Nigeria, how are we taking advantage of deploying the fourth industrial revolution, perhaps from the standpoint of Internet of Things, artificial intelligence?
The possibilities are endless. And what is very clear, you know, when you really look at and study the fourth industrial revolution and these ideas, is that it is really going to define the future. Now, where I have my own reservations is really about in whose interest is this future being built. We talk about, you know, Leo, or we talk about Ada, or whatever it is, but how many people can actually use those systems, right? How many people do these systems actually reach? Do they have the impact and the scale that they should?
When we talk financial inclusion now, for those who...
Well, not just financial inclusion. I'm just talking in broad terms. 95% of people in the banking system don't have up to 15,000 naira in their bank accounts. So what are we discussing with Leo for, or Ada for? It serves such a small sliver of the population, and you really have to have the mindset to think much more broadly about these tools. Otherwise, they're going to be a waste. But what I do really believe is the fact that the fourth industrial revolution does represent some sort of redemption for our society. If you think about what the possibilities are, the same AI that allows Ada to communicate with you is the same AI that can help banks to understand where to best place branches to serve people. It can help banks understand how best to support small businesses with loans. It can also help banks to, instead of the jamboree of just giving people 10,000 naira, better understand what exact support a trader needs to be able to build a fantastic business. So I think the disappointment for me as an entrepreneur, and quite frankly the challenge as well, is that we've taken the fourth industrial revolution and the future that it represents and pigeonholed it into a tool for serving a maximum of 1 million rich people, when we could actually extend its benefits with a serious government, with proper private sector involvement, with better education to 85, 88, 100 million people across the country. And I think it's a poverty of ambition that we just haven't gotten there yet.
Very interesting point of view there, that you share that sentiment.
You know, when he was mentioning Ada and Leo, those are bots for the banks, right? That can speak to the customers today. But you know, when I think about this, and it's a conversation we had in San Francisco during the Young Global Leaders Summit that we had recently, where we're thinking, when we think about fourth industrial revolution, many countries are at different starting points for this, right? And Africa as a continent, we have our, and even within that, the 53 countries, we have our different starting points and views with that. I cannot see myself leapfrogging in a society that I still don't have power, or that I still don't have roads, or basic education, like you mentioned.
Well, like I said,
so
the fourth...
I think, no, I agree, and I think there's a lot that can come out of it. We use technology. I believe technology should enable in every way.
And the world is moving on.
The world is moving on.
But if I can say something, we talk about these basic challenges like technology can't solve them. And that is because of how technology is used in our society today. We talk about power. Today, the most successful electrification project in the history of this country is powered by solar, and by a very small company that's basically working with the Rural Electrification Authority set up under the current government. It's one of the few good things they've actually done to power these centers of commerce.
Precisely, but in a country of 170 million people, how are we scaling that power?
That's fantastic.
So
that's 11 markets.
What we agree on,
exactly.
and on governance and all of that.
I thought technology was, providing real solutions to, real
That's what it is, but it hasn't worked that way for us. You know, we just haven't applied technology beyond Leo and all these gimmicks. The reality is...
We have the fintechs who are working, especially in the financial inclusion
but they don't have the scale.
Space. Getting people to use, those who are outside of the banking sector, maybe obviously through the use of mobile phones to pay for stuff, or just be part of the financial system.
Yeah, I hear you, but one thing I want to say is this: they don't have the scale, and the regulator is raising.
Think as time goes on that they can't scale?
Yes.
No. Well, I would argue that the regulator has consistently tried, and I don't know why, to raise the bar so that it's actually harder for them to get to scale. When the regulator has put in place a regime that tells you have to have $50 million for you to be able to lend. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? Or continually puts these very high barriers in the way of people who can actually leverage technology to create impact. Then we have to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of our consistent application of this fourth industrial revolution and the technology principles? Is the purpose to keep the rich richer? Or is the purpose for us to build a society where everybody has opportunity and has access to the benefits of technology? Like I said, the fourth industrial revolution is a redemptive thing. It's basically, in my mind, because I'm a person of faith, God's final rope to us in saying, hey, I'm giving you technology that can enable you to spread the impact, right? To spread, to create wealth across millions and hundreds of millions of people. But what we've done as a society is take the same tools and keep them in the service of the top 100,000. And that can scale and it will work.
Worldwide. That's the problem with globalization, right? And that's what we're talking about. It's not inclusive. The rich, the big, they got richer. You said it at the start. Yeah. And the poor have got, and so those are the issues we're discussing today. And that's why today you're having nonprofit, civil society coming into this conversation to talk about how are we truly changing the narrative for everybody else, and not just the top 1% or whatever you want to say.
One other big theme, even for the WEF next year, is entrepreneurship. We know that Africa has been big on that. We've seen, especially on the innovation front, fintechs, coming in and just driving innovation. Like I said earlier, providing solutions to real life problems, especially even in the rural areas. You mentioned solar then. So I'm just thinking, for us, would you say that our approach to entrepreneurship on the African continent, Ada, what have you seen that could make you say, oh, Africa is leapfrogging maybe in tech, in agriculture, deploying tech? we're leapfrogging and we're having a proper entrepreneurship mindset,
yes,
and we're solving our problems, African solutions, African
yes,
problems.
without a doubt, I think that we are known to just be those entrepreneurs. We're self-starters, and it's really by virtue of the society. You know, we've been forced to become entrepreneurs. Most Africans have, and young people specifically, when you're having, you know, about 10 million people entering the workforce every year, and only 60% of them are still without jobs. You know, it doesn't make sense. So these young people, somebody was in my office today, you know, a young guy who'd graduated, and he couldn't find a job, and he was trying to start up an agricultural firm, and he was like, this is what I have to do to make a living. So we can't discount it, but then there are all sorts of roadblocks. Yes, you can leapfrog, but then they need capital, they need support. How do I do a business? How do I get training, education, basics?
Basic education.
So it is definitely a way to go, and if that's the case, we need to just find ways. As a government, you still need your government. You still need a functioning system.
That is from a policy perspective.
From a
Yes.
policy perspective, to make the environment work.
Absolutely.
But definitely it is a way, it's a solution for wealth creation, and we just have to harness it.
You know what? Africa has we have a very huge youth population.
Absolutely.
And so many experts have described our youth population as a ticking time bomb. If we don't
Yes.
find either help them through the entrepreneurship path or find them jobs or help them to create jobs themselves, we're going to have a big problem 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the line. In your experience and what you've seen so far in terms of how governments, especially here on the continent, are taken perhaps a different approach to creating jobs or helping youths, you know, supporting them in whatever way to, you know, help create those jobs. What have you seen, and what do you think perhaps we should also be doing to make that
first
happen?
of all, I do disagree with those experts. I don't see our young people as a ticking time bomb. I think they're the greatest unharnessed resource that we have. And they could become a ticking time bomb if we don't do the work that is required to take these young, talented people and turn them into something that can create value, especially in the fourth industrial revolution. So that's for me, that's the first port of call. The layering on top of that is really, first of all, deeply investing in education and skills. At the end of the day, if you think about one thing that can turn this country around, it's not infrastructure. It's not, it's not going to be, even better managing debt. It's not a new refinery. It's going to be, how are we going to take our education system, which today doesn't work for the vast majority of young people, whether you're talking about the skills they need to learn now or the skills they need to learn in 10 years to continue to become relevant. Yeah. We need to take that education system, make it more accessible, increase the quality, and improve the relevance, right? For us to be able to turn our greatest human resource into something that actually shapes the fourth industrial revolution, not just for Africa, but for the rest of the world. And I come back again to the example of an Andela, which is what has happened here, right? Today you have 1,500 Andela developers across 5 African countries, servicing the top companies in the United States, tech companies in the United States. It's talent from the same place as we come from this place that everybody is calling a ticking time bomb, that's actually doing the work. And there's no reason why that model can't be scaled. There's no reason why universities shouldn't be turned into those type of centers where people can go and learn relevant skills that make them part of the fourth industrial revolution, not just in Africa, but globally.
And I remember when Bill Gates was in the country earlier this year, and he talked about how he's not seen enough investments in human capital and education, and especially health. And, working as a journalist for several years now, I've come to realize that for governments, and just looking at the annual budgets, it's always, education, health always get a shorter end of the stick. And that's because, the argument is there's so many, other sectors competing for the few resources that we have. And then we've seen that decline in revenues, in the course, in the last couple of years. So how do we begin to get the governments to have perhaps a rethink or reprioritize and tell them that, look, maybe you might not get the gains now if you invest more, turn things around and put more money in education, health. At least let's have a healthy population. Let's have a more educated population. Get them to rethink and say, we might not get the gains in 2 or 3 years, but down the line, there's a huge benefit, that's waiting.
So the government,
how do we begin to influence that,
but
policy
they know.
They know.
They know what to do.
Do they?
They do. But so
do.
so it's either we're changing the people there because maybe they don't want to do it and they know.
And they don't want to do it.
And we get people who are ready to do it and focus on the investments that are necessary to move our country forward and our young people forward to really take advantage of the fourth industrial revolution.
If you ask me, I'll tell you this much, right? They know. I'll tell you for a fact, they all know. I'll tell you also for a fact that they do not care.
No, but what if it, because the fact that, revenue constraint is real. At that, I will tell you. Even with good intention, revenue constraints are real.
I'll tell you this much. Even with the revenue constraints, which they don't admit, by the way, if you look at the budget that was announced yesterday by the president, it's a Lala budget. They don't agree. But beyond that fact, I want to tell you this much, right? At the end of the day, we as a nation and as a continent, actually, because what's happening in Nigeria is replicable across Africa in many ways, have to make a decision. And that decision has to be very simple. Are we content, right, with a 4-year political drama that delivers nothing but filled private pockets? Or are we going to make the bold move, right, to actually design a future for the continent that carries everybody along? Because if we do not make that decision, it doesn't matter what the budget constraints are. It doesn't matter whether they know or they don't know. What will end up happening is very simple. A few people will play this drama. A few people will get rich. A few people will take that wealth abroad. A few people will invest in other countries' fourth industrial revolution.
Yes.
And the talent that we need to have a fourth industrial revolution here, it's not about money, it's not about infrastructure. It is purely a talent war because it's a knowledge economy.
Iyinoluwa, I'm going to have to ask you to hold that thought for us. We need to take a short break, and I thank you so much for your time so far. I've been speaking to Osakwe, CEO of Agrolay Ventures, and Iyinoluwa Aboyeji, co-founder, Andela, and of course, they're both World Economic Forum Young Global Leaders. We'll continue our discussion right after this short break. To join us again. Welcome back to CNBC Africa's Road to Davos broadcast. If you're just joining us, Osakwe, CEO of Agrolay Ventures, and Iyinoluwa Aboyeji, co-founder Andela, the both World Economic Forum Young Global Leaders, here with me as we build up to the World Economic Forum's 2019 annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland. Thank you so much for your time so far. Sure. Now, we're in an age of trade wars, countries looking inwards, trying to create jobs, keep their jobs, keep their sectors strong, and just like I mentioned earlier, that wave of protectionism. Yes. So the question has been asked several times: what kind of economy does Africa want to have going forward, and what kind of role is Africa going to play on the world economic stage? Yes. We've seen mixed growth, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. In countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, we've seen growth of as high as 6%, but overall, still not enough to put us on the map. Ada, let me start with you. How do we begin to get that growth that we need? Do we need deeper structural, the IMF, the World Bank keep pointing to fiscal reforms, structural reforms, let's have power, let's have better infrastructure, but these are things that many African countries continue to struggle with.
Forgive me if I feel sometimes I'm talking like someone who just feels everything is so futile and that we've talked, and nothing's really happening. I'm someone who's worked in the development finance space for many years. I worked with the African Development Bank, where we were talking the same issues, promoting it for Africa. Then went on to federal government. I worked in private sector. Now I've started my own business. So I've seen, and all within Africa. So I'm not so sure. I can't prescribe anything here that hasn't been prescribed already. But it's about how do we ensure that even if we get started, we stay on that track. That we don't have policy somersaults, that there's consistency, that there's a vision. You go to Dubai, we all like flying Emirates to go for the holiday. Right now, Nigerians are going to take off for the holiday, right? You go there, and these people are already planning 70 years ahead. They have committees planning. What are we doing to make sure that we're relevant in this case? But I kind of want to bring it, as we talk about relevance, and let me think about some of the things that Africa can indeed take a lead in. We're talking in this age of, nationalism and sovereignty, everybody looking inwards, and protectionism. And that's happening with the issues of migration. And it's big. It's big because we have our young Africans dying in the Mediterranean every single day today because they're trying to get out. And they're trying to go to countries, taking that terrible journey, falling out, and not being welcomed. So recently, as you know, the UN has pushed forward the Migration Pact and all, that many countries are not even signing on to as well. So what do we do as Africans to take on this as ourselves and take care of ourselves? First of all, inwards, we make sure that we're dealing with the issues that cause this emigration from our lands. That's fixing, creating jobs, educating, and making sure that we keep our young people here. But at the same time, a lot's going on, even with countries in Africa that are taking in other migrants and thinking of solutions that ensure that they feel safe and that they are kept and they feel like they're part of the new economy. And I'll give an example that the World Economic Forum has been working on. So a group of young global leaders, earlier this year, we went to Kakuma in Kenya. It's the camp, one of the biggest refugee camps out there. Okay. A lot of people come from South Sudan, from Uganda, running and fleeing different civil wars. Young people, most of the people in the camp, of over 100,000 people in the camp, are women and young children. And they're there today, and you find a government who is actively trying to find a market-based solution. That let's not tell them what they need to do. Let's not give them handouts as refugees, right, who are coming here. Let's work together and see how we can foster entrepreneurship, because maybe they can't get the rights to work in Kenya, but until then they can start businesses. It's a thriving economy. You have the International Finance Corporation that did some work and found that, you know, it was a $54 million economy in just that little camp. So how are we thinking about ensuring that we are empowering situations like that? Because it's Africa taking charge of its own problems, right? And not going to countries in the West to ask for handouts or ask for capital to deal with this issue when we can. Our African leaders can be dealing with it. And that's what we're trying to do, you know, as the World Economic Forum Young Global Leaders, to support in every way we can as entrepreneurs, as people with a network, to go into those camps and do what we have to do, working with the UN refugee camps. So okay. I think that's an important issue to bring to light on migration.
Iyinoluwa, what is your perspective?
You know, very much like she said, there's none of these solutions that haven't been thought through. But what I like to say, you know, is that, first of all, let's consider what Africa's place in the world is, or what it needs to be. Over the next 35 years, over half of the world's working population is going to be resident in Africa. Whether or not there is migration, that is a fact. That's a responsibility as well.
Yes.
Because it means that we have in the fourth industrial revolution, we have the responsibility of being the engine room of the world. This is where the work that powers the fourth industrial revolution, if we want an optimal world, has to happen, regardless of what's happening with trade wars everywhere else in the world. And the work that is involved in the fourth industrial revolution is not possible for you to bind that by trade borders. You can't create protectionism around AI. You cannot create protectionism around biohacking. You cannot create protectionism around 3D printing. It is not possible. And that represents a boundless future if and only if we have the right kind of leadership that can shepherd us there. Okay. And so, for me, I always say, but the alternative, which is the reality that we're currently living now, is one where we are graduating from a politics of failure to governments of failure, and ultimately to states of failure. And that is the stem we have to turn. And I wonder, personally, if you want to build a sustainable business in Africa, and something I always think about, that will last 100 years, you cannot avoid dealing with the politics.
Okay. You can't.
Now, still on the outlook for Africa next year and the role the African economy can play on the world stage, a lot is happening. As you know, there's Brexit on the one hand, there's the trade wars, so all of that has made countries to begin to look, as I said, look inwards. And we've also seen a situation where reps from countries in Europe, the US, the UK, have come to Africa. Some of them have come to Nigeria this year specifically to forge new bilateral, not just bilateral ties, trade ties. And this is also happening at a time when Africa we're still debating and trying to, you know, finalize the African Free Trade Agreement area where, you know, Africa will begin to trade more with itself. Intra-African trade is something we've talked about for so many years, and we have seen little you know, happen on that front. But I'm thinking that perhaps things could be different this time if Africa can come, you know, together and, you know, agree on this and begin to trade more trade within the continent. Do you think that if we are able to achieve that, Ada, if we're able to achieve that, and maybe get some good trade deals with our partners in Europe and UK and wherever other continents, we can begin to have a more defined role on the global economic stage, and we can begin to stand our ground, hold our own, and say, okay, we are a formidable, at least a force to be reckoned with from the economic point of view.
I completely think so. I agree, and we do have an opportunity, and yes, we've been talking about it for so long, but I love the fact that there is progress being made. The African Union is moving on it. Before you can trade, you have to talk about mobility, right? Freedom of movement around countries, and as you know, I don't know the numbers where they are now, but visa-free.
African countries.
Nigeria has signed on to that, and now it's visa on arrival, and that makes such a huge difference. So there is progress being made, and I believe that there's enough of the people who are pushing for this. It's the only way if we want to be relevant on the global stage.
If I can add something.
Sure.
What I do know for a fact is that for 1% of growth in South Africa and Nigeria, right, you have 0.5% growth across the continent, right? For every 1% of growth. And that's the kind of impact that Nigeria and South Africa have. A free trade agreement without the political class in Nigeria and South Africa saying the right things and understanding that they have to lead on this process and not simply leave this to Rwanda and Kagame is the only way that we're going to get a continental free trade agreement that actually works. We may get something that is a fantastic effort, but the business leaders in Nigeria and South Africa have to have a phone call, have a meeting with the presidents and the political class in these countries and say, look, we're willing to exclude you from the continent if you will hold us back. Sign this agreement today.
Yeah, and I completely agree with him. And, you think about the African Development Bank that just had its Africa Investment Forum recently, and it wasn't a talk shop. This was about, let's get these deals done. Let's work together as business people. Let's sign these agreements, put capital to work. And that's how they left it. Egypt recently was very similar. People went out there for the trade forum, Inter-African Trade Forum, and they came out with signed deals. Yes, we want to make sure that they're executed and it happens, but this was not happening a few years ago. So we're moving.
As WEF global leaders, Iyinoluwa, let me start with you. What are your hopes for Africa? When you think of Africa 10, 20 years from now, we've talked a lot about the importance of political will. Yes, it's good to have this, economic forums and trade fairs talking about what the problems are and how we can, come about, enforce or implement those solutions. But what are your hopes, and what do you see that gives you hope and that makes you say, yes, I can hold on, this is something for me to hold on to, and so that 20 years down the line, this is what I'm expecting to see?
I think the first of all is that young people are deliberately ignoring a tired and old political governance and business structures and are willing to question them and turn them over their head. It's very important because if we don't disrupt the established business interests, the established political interests that have held our continent back, we're not going to see progress. That's the first step. The second thing that gives me a lot of hope is that these young people are now taking the bull by the horn, empowered by technology that gives us the ability to transform our continent. And they're very, very focused on how can we lift people out of poverty? How can we give people opportunity? They're not focused on what's my market cap. They're not focused on what's, how much billions did I make this year in revenue? They're focused on what exactly will it take for us to create social change. And I would say the third thing that gives me a lot of hope is the fact that new technology tools, social media, video especially, Instagram, are now connecting people that weren't connected before along those two lines. And I think it's going to be fantastic what happens over the next 20 years in terms of how a new coalition of the excluded, as I like to call them, creative young people creating fantastic businesses, leveraging the tools of the fourth industrial revolution, transform the continent.
Ada, 30 seconds.
I think very similar to what he said, and the focus, yes, for me is our youth, the young people. Ultimately, I just hope that we can all live more dignified lives, meaning that we feel we're empowered with education, we feel we're empowered with a good job, and that we can create and define our own future. So that, for me, in many ways, encapsulates a lot of the things you said, and looking forward to just a more inclusive society.
Okay, thank you so much, guys. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show today. I've been speaking to Osakwe, CEO of Agrolay Ventures, and Iyinoluwa Aboyeji, co-founder, Andela, their Build World Economic Forum Young Global Leaders. So that's it on our special Road to Davos broadcast. Thank you so much for being a part of it. From myself and the team, to have a great day.